America music from happier times. I'm joined by Admiral James Stavridis, retired United States Navy, of course, former Allied Supreme Commander, also of NATO, also head of Southern Command. And on January 22nd, with me on this show, a predictor of doom. And so early to the bell, Tom Cotton, the Admiral, and me were. I wish we had been wrong. We were right. Now the question is, what do we do? Admiral, this is grim, but you've seen grim things before, right?
I have, and someone asked me the other day what this was like, and the only thing I could come up with is it's not like 2008 financial crisis, and it's not like 9/11. Hugh, it's kind of a combination of those two things. In other words, it's the uncertainty about the broad security and how this will come out globally, combined with the obvious economic danger that is dead ahead of us. So it is the most unsettling time of my life, and I'm in my early 60s. So this is one to worry about. Here's the good news. I think we have all the tools to deal with this. There will be damage to the economy. We are going to lose a fair number of people before it's all over, but we are going to come around this thing. What we ought to be thinking about is what can we do to prepare for the next pandemic so we don't remake some of the mistakes we've seen so far.
Now, Admiral, I'm going to give you a different analogy. I've been describing it to people like a worldwide Katrina. We saw its approach. It has come ashore in some places. The early tip of the storm has hit in New York and of course, in Italy and China. But it's going to stay overland a long time. And the thing I think people need to know, again, we discussed, I talked to Tony Fauci about this last week, the 1918 pandemic, with you and I are both aware, that's why we were conversing with this in January, went away during the summer of 18 and came back even more virulent in the fall. I don't know that people are looking out 6 months on the downside. They're hoping, they're praying. We're Americans, we always do this, but we actually have to adopt a 1942 approach, don't we?
Indeed, we do. And we ought to make another point about Spanish influenza, and it's a fortunate one. Spanish influenza primarily attacked the young, the most vigorous among us. This pandemic is going after the elderly. Now, we're starting to see shifts in those numbers, and that's another watch out here, is a tendency to say, well, it's going to be centered among those who are 70 years old and older. Maybe not, especially, here's your point, Hugh, in that second wave. We also ought to remember that viruses can mutate. We aren't seeing that to a great degree thus far, but unfortunately it's early days. So as I said before, we ought to be thinking way past whenever we reopen the U.S. economy and reopen the global economy. We ought to be thinking stockpiles of medical supplies, of training programs for personnel to deal with this, of our ability to put up makeshift rapid hospitals, how we can surge capacity. Because if there is a second wave, we have to be prepared for it. Shame on us if we're not prepared the second time around, particularly looking back at Spanish influenza.
Now, Admiral, Arthur Herman wrote a book called Freedom's Forge on how FDR turned the American economy into the arsenal of democracy. And there was a piece by Arthur in the Wall Street Journal this week into turning it into the world's medicine cabinet. I want to focus on two things for you. One, short term, the Department of Defense is about to receive $10 billion in plus-up. Who should control where that goes? There will be direction. I haven't seen the bill yet. I just know the number is $10 billion. How should the Pentagon follow that money? Number two, as you put on your geopolitical hat, the world is going to change dramatically. It's going to shift on its axis. We could have revolution in places like Iran and Venezuela, destabilizing levels of death and illness and leadership changes. How would you prepare the chain of command and the people who have to watch the world for this? So short term, what's DOD do with this much money? Suddenly, longer term, who ought to be thinking? We don't have an Andy Marshall right now, and we need one.
Mm-hmm. Andy Marshall, for those who aren't familiar with him, was one of the great thinkers of our time who spent decades in the Pentagon looking broadly, strategically, and making the right choices for the country. He saw, for example, the rise of China well before anybody else did. Let's think tactically about how to spend that money. I think a chunk of it needs to go into intelligence and our ability to see around the corners and to analyze the changes that are coming. And that's everything from our satellite surveillance systems to our ability to follow events on the ground, human, if you will, human intelligence. Secondly, I think there will be a premium on unmanned vehicles coming out of the other side of this thing. This event is going to make us even less enthusiastic, if you will, about large troop deployments. And of course, one of the ironies of this, Hugh, is Spanish influenza came out of the deployment of U.S. troops. Despite the fact that it's called Spanish influenza, it should be called the DOD influenza. It came out of U.S. troop deployments. And then, so that would be second, I think, unmanned vehicles. And thirdly, I think special forces are always a good place to invest as you're in uncertain times because they're so flexible and can be moved in so many different ways. And fourthly, I'm going to say cyber and cybersecurity. There's a kind of, if you will, a second wave coming here, which will be the vulnerability of our systems to cyber because we have taken the eye off of that ball, to put it appropriately, on Spanish influenza. In terms of the second question, and globally, how does this start to shake out? I think one big muscle movement will be if China really comes roaring out of this thing, having turned the corner and can avoid that second wave, China will burnish its credentials when it goes to parts of the world to say, look at us. Our authoritarian capitalist model is a really good one. Look how quickly we were able to marshal resources, to use authoritarianism to turn a corner quickly on this. It'll become a major talking point for China. We ought to watch that. We need to have counters to that, hopefully through our own competence. And then the other one to watch just this morning, Hugh, India. India, 1.3 billion people packed in, just announced a 21-day shutdown of their country. That's where I would be very concerned about radicalization in those elements. We could talk about Pakistan, Venezuela. There are other terrible situations developing, but I'd watch for China to rise and India to come into some danger as this unfolds.
My worry is that Iran, under extraordinary pressure from a death toll, will divert attention via aggression, but I'll come back to that. I want you to drill down, Admiral, if you will. There are 5,000 families, and mine is among them, with a crewmate on the Teddy Roosevelt where there are 3 cases of COVID. And there will be other ships with COVID. And I want you to put on your old ship driver hat. What would your advice be to anyone with a ship at sea? I'm sure DOD is sending out reams of guidance, but what would your advice be to any driver of a ship where they've got sailors of any rank down with the COVID?
Yeah, speaking of sailing, Enterprise, when I was the commander of Enterprise Carrier Strike Group, was deployed in that beautiful carrier, just decommissioned about a year ago. And we had a terrible flu epidemic going around that ship. And it was stomach flu, which is a pretty horrible thing on a ship, as you can imagine. Probably a virus similar to those which go around on cruise ships occasionally. And so, point one, tactically, you do all the exact same things you would do on a cruise ship or any other close quarters, endless hand washing, wiping down. The good news is you've got a lot of people to go out and do that. The bad news is, you pointed it out already, people are just packed into these spaces. And for listeners who aren't navalists like you and I, picture your kitchen with 15 people living in it. That's a barracks, if you will, at sea, where our enlisted folks are. People aren't in luxurious separated staterooms. So tactically, you've got to do all of the things that are done on a cruise ship. And secondly, for the commanding officer of Teddy Roosevelt, and I'm sure he's all over this, is you've got to be informing people about what's going on. The uncertainty is maybe the worst thing. The good news is you've got not only internal announcing systems, but television throughout the ship. You can go on, set up from your own broadcast studio I would suspect the kind of COVID-19 briefings that we're all getting used to with the Vice President and Tony Fauci and Deborah Bricks and others, you're seeing those done on the Roosevelt probably every day by the captain, by the Admiral if he or she is embarked, telling the story, keeping the crew settled, doing all of those kinds of strategic and morale things. You have to put that alongside the tactical, I think, here as well.
My last question, Admiral. This week I've been pushing the idea of beat the bug bonds because I know in World War I and World War II we financed the war by selling bonds at 75% of par value, and it gave citizens something to do when they don't have a ventilator to donate, when they can't care for an emergency room patient, when they can't visit the other. They can dig into their savings. They can work an extra hour and buy a bond. What do you think of bringing back those campaigns from those days?
I love the idea, and I am riding this one out down in Florida because we have 80-something parents who live nearby, so I'm here with my wife. And on the wall in my small office here, Hugh, is a signed letter from Dwight Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, when he was General Eisenhower. And he was a young girl wrote him and said, President Eisenhower, what should I do? I've saved up $25. Shall I buy a bond or shall I buy a bicycle? And President Eisenhower, then General Eisenhower, said, buy that bond. There's always time to buy the bicycle.
Got a little chill there. Got a little chill.
Yeah, it's a wonderful letter. I'll send you a copy of it. And it is a great idea in my view because, and let's close on this, Hugh, we are all in this together. Wherever you are on the political spectrum, we are all in this together.
Admiral James Stavridis, retired United States Navy, thank you. I'd love